You're a fool.
Nope.
Before I cut these down and square them up, I need to make sure that they're flat, and that just means a lot of sanding to remove any excess glue and to even out any areas on that seam that aren't quite flush. To do this, I'm starting with a 60 grit sandpaper. An 80 grit sandpaper would work fine too. In other words, just a rough sandpaper. A couple of things I want you to keep in mind when you're sanding these is to first, expect to spend some time flattening these out using a random orbit sander. It's not going to be a fast process. For me to do all 6 sides here took about a half an hour. And keep in mind that the goal here using the rough sandpaper is to flatten these out. We're not trying to smooth these yet, so you don't need to go up to a finer grit sandpaper yet. Another tip to keep in mind is while you're trying to even out that seam between the 2 boards is try to avoid just focusing only on that, because you could end up with kind of a divot in the panel. So usually I just like to kind of do a figure 8 pattern that keeps it fairly even throughout the panel. And I'll give special attention to certain high areas. It's a little bit of a, I guess, an art rather than a science. And you could test these just to see how flat you're getting by using a straight edge and sighting down the face of the board, but don't drive yourself crazy with that. If there's a little bit of unevenness, it's okay. The way I've designed this box is that all 6 sides are gonna be ripped the exact same size. That's gonna simplify this a lot. And that means that first we need to cut down the width of each of these panels to 10 1/8 inches. But if you'll remember, when I jointed these 2 boards together, I didn't cut these 2 sides. So I don't want to just cut it down to that final measurement. First, I want to shave off a little bit on one side. In other words, basically jointing it again. Then I can flip it over and measure it to the exact width. So I'll set up my rip fit so that I'm cutting about a saw blade thickness off the edge. Another thing to look out for are maybe knots that might be on one edge. So I want to joint this edge first by just shaving a little bit off, and then when I cut this to its final width, it'll cut right about here and I'll be able to completely remove that knot. In general, knots aren't a problem. It's just when they're on the edge of a board, they can fall out and leave you with a knot hole. Now I can set up my rip fence to make an exact 10 1/8 inch cut. This time I'll run that edge that I just cut along the rip fence. Now what I can do is cut out the top, the bottom, and then the front and the back sides of the box. The 2 short ends, I don't want to cut those down to their exact size just yet. We're going to save this piece, the shortest piece, for later. And all 4 of these pieces are going to be the exact same length, so that should be pretty simple. But what we got to do is use the miter gauge to cut these out. So these 2 edges are what we're going to use as a reference to square up the 2 ends. I'll just assume that you've already calibrated your miter gauge so that it's square to your saw blade. So the first thing to do is to square off one end of each board. And you can double check that with a square if you want, and it should be pretty accurate. Now we can cut these 2 longer panels down to 4 14-inch pieces. There'd be 2 on each one. I've got this fancy kind of miter gauge here where I can set up this stop block here exactly 14 inches from the blade, so that each cut, I just line it up with that and run it through so they'll all be exactly the same. You probably have one of these kind of miter gauges that came with your saw, and you can use that too. What you need to do is grab a scrap board, piece of plywood or whatever, and just make an extension fence. There's gonna be a couple of holes or something in there where you can screw a board onto this, and then you would clamp another board over here someplace. You'd measure out 14 inches from the blade, clamp this on there, and then that will give you your stop block each time. Whenever you've got multiple pieces to cut that are all the same length or width, you don't want to just draw a line on each one and expect them all to be exactly the same. So always try to set up a jig, a stop block, something to give you that repeatable cut. I mean, it kind of depends upon the size of the project. If you're building like a huge fence or something, you could probably get away with just measuring out pieces and marking them and cutting them. All right, so to recap here, you're gonna have 4 boards that are all gonna be the exact same size, 10 1/8 by 14. That's gonna be the top, bottom, front, and back. This piece, what I did is I already cut that, I squared off the one edge, but I haven't cut this down to size. Once we start assembling the box, it'll become clear why I don't wanna cut this just yet. Hey, I thought I'd step outside of my shop. My shop is like 3 feet away there. And I'm sitting on my purple bench, but I thought it made sense to come outside since I'm gonna be showing you pictures from the Summer Jam heat wave. We don't have a whole lot of heat waves in the Bay Area. It's usually kind of pretty constant. Once in a while, it gets pretty hot, maybe up into the 90s. Those of you on Celsius, it's like 1,000 degrees. And for those of you on Kelvin, it's blue. Okay, first of all, I wanted to show you this picture because it's got a cat in it, and I think it's funny, but I don't know why it's funny. This is from Mike Reed. It just says it's a cat-friendly ramp. Whatever it is, the cat's just looking at the camera like, oh, what am I supposed to do here? Pretty much what cats always look like. This next one came from SSBBP. He built this entry door that's made out of teak. Wow, that looks like a great fit. The joints look really tight on that thing. So this is from Madeline, and she actually made this garden bench in the one weekend, which is pretty impressive. She says it's a new personal record. She said there's a lot of rustic charm in this one. She said you had to improvise a lot with tools and materials, but we're all our own worst critics. I think it looks great. And Madeline says she's a member of the Weekend Workshop course. Thank you so much for being a member of that. And she does a nice little plug for the course. And we've got a lawn chair from Tim Niedsten. He says it's his first serious project made over the weekend. Douglas fir lawn chair. He says they're actually having a heat wave in the Netherlands too. That's a great looking chair. Wow, if you can make a chair in 2 days, that's impressive. And I love the way that Mean Obi-Wan interpreted the theme heat wave. He made this TV remote box because when those Texas heat waves hit, it's time to get out of the shop and into the AC and turn on the TV. More to come.